Recorded at Get a Grip Studios in Toronto, Canada. A Get a Grip management production and in association with the Get a Grip on Lighting podcast. Financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors and presented by the National Lighting Bureau, the Illuminating Engineering Society, and the International Dark Sky Association. Added to the IES's 2021 Progress Report. This is Starving for Darkness, a podcast. Hey folks, Starving for Darkness is coming in hot in 1 second. Jane's ready to go, I know that. And you guys are ready to listen. But before we do, we got to talk about Evluma, the people that sponsor this show, the magicians. evluma.com. Hover over products, click Dark Sky Friendly, and hit up that Omnimax, Greg.
And why you do that is because the OmniMax can fit in just about every existing outdoor fixture that's out there. It's a retrofit bulb itself, and it has a Kelvin temperatures from 2K up to 5K, medium and multiple base, 20 kV to 10 kA surge protection, has a photo control fail-safe, which if your photocell goes out, this bulb, we'll call it, learns it over time, and then it will mimic whatever that photocell did. So it knows what it needs to do without the expense of having to go and replace the photocell. And all of it's in a compact size, so it's going to fit in your existing fixture.
Go to evluma.com, hover over products, click on Dark Sky Friendly Lighting. God, they're doing it so right. Check them out, evluma.com. Now, here comes Starving for Darkness.
Hello, listeners and darkness lovers. Welcome to another episode of Starving for Darkness. My name is Jane Slade, and I'm so pleased to bring on our next guest, Megan Porter, PhD. Dr. Megan Porter is an associate professor in the School of Life Sciences at the University of Hawaiʻi at Mānoa. Her research program at the Porter Vision Lab is focused on understanding the evolution of animal eye diversity, particularly from a molecular perspective. Megan, welcome to the show. Thank you so much. And we start every episode with the same request. Would you please tell us about a dark sky experience that left you with a feeling of awe?
Oh, absolutely. There are many, but I think in most recent history, a lot of the work that I do involves collecting at night. So I study things that live in the ocean, and a lot of those are collected at night. They're attracted to lights at night, and so we use that to our advantage to collect them. And before moving to Hawaii, much of my work was done in Australia and the Northern Great Barrier Reef. And there are many nights I can remember standing out in the ocean in about waist deep water, no one else around, and just the dark sky above me, with my light being the only light. And so I was looking at all these things in the ocean swimming, which is sort of a sky and sort of universe of its own, and then looking up and seeing the Milky Way and all of the stars that you can see without any being close to any human population anyway. It's very memorable nights of field work and collecting. Those nights, they're very, very tranquil and peaceful.
Yeah, well,
such a thing
you're
in field work.
Yeah, I mean, you're communing almost twice over with nature because not only are you underneath this natural dark night sky, but you're also feeling everything that the ocean is giving you too, the feeling of the waves, the animals. So it sounds like a very deeply connected experience. And actually, I've recently been having all these thoughts about how the natural daylight cycle, we talk about presence. And, when we're in electric light, actually, it's sort of like a disconnection from the natural daylight cycle. But the natural daylight cycle is sort
Absolutely.
of this like connected light source that all living things tap into. So you were there connecting to the natural light cycle, which is a way of connecting into the present moment. So let's dive into your work. So you have a
Okay.
vision lab, the Porter Vision Lab. Congrats to you. That's amazing. I'm just so proud to see
Thank you.
a female accomplish such a feat to have your own research lab. Because I know that is always the goal, and it doesn't happen for every PhD. So congrats
No,
on
it's getting
that.
harder and
A-
harder. Thank you.
Yeah, it really is. And so on your website, you state that your primary focus is on the molecular evolution of crustacean visual systems and development of anything that has unusual eyes. So can you talk
Yes.
about just your work in the macro?
Sure. And since starting my own lab, my work has really diversified a lot because of the interests of my students, right? They get to decide
Hmm.
what they are interested in working on. And our criteria here is as long as it's got eyes or detects light in some way, we can study it using the sort of
Hmm.
techniques that we use. So my research background was focused really on crustaceans. So think of crabs, shrimp, lobsters, those sorts of things, crayfish, and understanding their visual systems. And my work is really based in understanding the molecules that detect light in visual systems. So the
Hmm.
protein that's actually responsible for detecting light, and then uh, basically telling the cell that it has detected light of a particular wavelength, which we see as color. Um,
Hmm.
so understanding the evolution of that, how different animals can see different colors, is all based uh, at the most basic level on the molecules that they have and the differences between those molecules. That's a protein we call opsin. So
Hmm.
my work is based in looking at animal eyes, seeing how many types of opsins they express, and we can then look at those proteins, look at their structure, look at their composition, and we can make some inferences about their visual systems that way. Um, I started off in vision studying crabs, lobsters, and then sort of moved to mantis shrimp, which a lot of people are familiar with for many reasons because they are really aggressive, which people like.
Hmm.
They have a tendency to hit things first and then investigate, and they have one of the fastest strikes in the animal kingdom. Um,
Wow.
but they also have a really complex visual system that we are still trying to understand. So, prior to my work on the molecular side of things, they had characterized using physiological techniques that they had, up to 16 different types of photoreceptors. For comparison, we have 3 photoreceptors for color vision, a separate photoreceptor for night vision. Um, some birds have 5 different photoreceptors, so they have sort of this level of complexity that's at least 3 times more most other animals that have been studied.
Yeah,
So,
this was one
uh,
of my questions for you because, I had heard that some aquatic species have just an amazing array of photoreceptors, which,
yes.
humans are always like, imagine if there was a color we hadn't seen. And it turns out there's a
Yes.
lot of colors we're not seeing. So, yeah,
Yes.
that's so interesting. So this animal is really seeing the world in a completely different way than we are. Is that part of
It
why you're so
is.
fascinated?
That is certainly part of it. Is my fascination with animal vision is because our as very visual creatures, right? So much of how we interact with the world around us is visual, and we tend to
Mhm.
transfer that perspective to everything when most things in the world, most animals in the world have a very different visual perspective, right? Their perception is
Mm.
very different than ours. And I'm trying very fascinated by trying to understand how other animals are seeing the world. What sorts of information are they detecting that we aren't? What sorts of visual cues can they see that we're completely blind to?
Mhm.
It's just how how we and certainly how other animals view the world informs so much of their behavior, their circadian and seasonal rhythms. I mean, light drives everything. And so understanding how other systems interact with that can tell us a lot about the biology of a particular species.
Yes. So in your work, what are you I mean, this is the million-dollar question for this episode. So, well, let's before I ask that question, you study bioluminescence. And according to
Yes.
your website, this is rare on land, but extremely common in the deep sea being found in 80% of the animals living between 200 and 1,000 meters. And so, can you talk about your work in bioluminescence?
Sure. And this is, there are many fantastic researchers who have been studying bioluminescence for much longer than I have. But my perspective, again, is trying to understand the molecules behind light detection and, in this case, light production. So, sort of
Mm-hmm.
expanded to thinking about both sides of that equation in a biological context. So, in an organism, how are organisms producing light? What are they
Mm-hmm.
using that for? And then how are they detecting it as well? And so we are part of my lab is part of a collaboration with a few other people looking specifically at a group of shrimp um, that live in the ocean, mid-water. So they migrate. So they tend to live deeper at night. During the day and come up at night. And they
Mm-hmm.
have different species have different modes of bioluminescence. We're specifically looking at those that have these light emitting structures called photophores. And
Mm-hmm.
these are structures on the body that produce light, generally on the underside, but they can have them sort of all over their back and along sort of their eyes. And different species have them in different places. They're typically thought to be used for counter illumination, so it's a form of camouflage in the open ocean. So
Interesting. Wow.
it's, if you think about the ocean, light is coming from above. It typically gets scattered and absorbed, so the deeper you get, bluer the light gets. And so
Mm-hmm.
if you are a predator hunting from below and you're looking up, you can see the shadow of things against the light coming from above. Um, but if you are trying to avoid being eaten and you can produce blue light that matches what's that's coming down from the
Wow.
surface, then you could be able to hide sort of out in the open, as it were. Um,
That's
that's
beautiful.
one
That's
strategy,
beautiful.
anyway.
Yeah.
Um, so that yeah, living in the open ocean is hard. That there's no place to hide. So you know, animals have taken different strategies to that. Bioluminescence being potentially one of those. My
I
research in
see. Yeah.
particular, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, well,
Um,
I was going to ask, so light is dissipating slowly with each sort of foot you go down in depth. And then it's really the blue light that can travel the best under to the deeper levels. But what about LED blue light and the the light pollution that we're seeing in water? How much
it's
does that penetrate the ocean?
so I think it is a massive, potentially massive uh, impact on marine organisms that people hasn't been well studied yet, I guess, except
Yeah.
in particular areas. There's some research groups, for example, in the Arctic, the polar Arctic, that has the polar night, where it's dark 24 hours a day during certain times of the
Hmm.
year. And so there've been people studying light pollution up there, where animals are not seeing any light. So coming in with
Right.
ships that are all lit up, or any of those sorts of things, like what effect is that having on marine life? So it's definitely impacting marine life in ways that are only beginning to be studied, I would say. And it may be changing, um, certainly sort of, coastal regions that have lots of light pollution. Say here on Hawaii, we have a big, tourist industry. There are giant high rises on the beach with lights everywhere. That is going to impact anything within that light radius uh, that that is moving around at night, potentially um, bringing things in from the ocean that wouldn't normally be there.
Hmm.
Changing rhythms, and it's going to have a huge impact that we don't totally understand yet. So there's that kind of interaction in the ocean, as well as these massive boats moving around the ocean that are all lit up
Yep.
are going to have more localized effects on where things are in the water column, how high they are, where they are moving around, all of that.
Yeah, I mean, this makes me want to ask some questions out loud that I know I don't have the answers to, and maybe you do or you don't, because it's veering more into the lighting realm. But um, it has been cited that a single LED fixture can actually pollute up to 120 miles away, but that's through air. And so, what is it through water? And another interesting fact is that we often, when we measure light pollution from space, the satellites don't actually even take into account the full bandwidth of light, specifically blue light.
Mm.
So we may not be actually measuring. So I find it interesting that blue light doesn't reach to space for the satellites to measure for whatever reason, or maybe the satellite, uh, maybe the satellite's not able to quantify the blue light. I don't know what the reason behind that is. So listeners, if you know, please reach out to us. But I find it interesting that it does penetrate the bellows of the water. So I just think that more clarity is certainly needed around that topic. And so here's my $1 million question. So what are you seeing in regards to light pollution and aquatic species?
So I think so my work is more understanding sort of the basics of visual systems and
Hmm.
understanding what wavelengths of light different species can detect and trying to then translate that to what they are doing with that information. So what behaviors do different wavelengths inform in an animal? So a lot of organisms in the ocean, as I mentioned with the shrimp, they're moving up and down on a daily cycle, which is a massive, the biggest migration on the planet is happening every night
Yes.
as animals are moving up from the depths and then back down during the day. And it's hugely important to, you know, um, cycling of nutrients and
Hmm.
ecology of the ocean, ecosystems, dynamics, all of these things. And that is all potentially all being driven by light. Light is certainly a component to it. We're not really sure how it's being integrated into that movement yet, but um, so understanding, I think, what wavelengths they're sensitive to is sort of a first step to understanding what a particular source of light pollution, what impact that's going to have. And one of the things that
Hmm.
I think people are starting to think about, in the ocean, most things see blue to blue green light because that's the light that's available. So changing the color of the light may lessen the impact to something that most animals in the system you're trying to protect can't detect. Um,
Right.
Another component of vision is temporal. So, um, you know, for some of the things on land, understanding what frequency of sort of flickering light can an animal see is important for either whether you're trying to attract an animal or warn them away. Understanding that may make an important difference. So all of these things, it's not just light; it's specific aspects of the light that may be impacting species. And so trying to understand
Hmm.
that, I think, is where my research lies.
Yeah, I think the time quality of light is so important. And actually, there's that whole theory time doesn't really exist, and that actually time is really the movement of the earth. It's the rotation and the revolution around the sun. So we measure time really in space. So it's kind of interesting, but light, if you separate it from time, I mean, we can't just blare light uh, 24 hours a day. The whole point of balance with regard to the natural daylight cycle is that it has an arc and an ebb and flow that has actually been the same for all life's evolution on Earth. So the aspect of time is critical when it comes to light on Earth. And so I think one of the things that I draw from your work is just the sheer diversity of vision that is has evolved on the planet. I think I was reading that there's even eyes placed on, we have eyes on our head, but are there eyes on other parts of the body as well for other species? And then there's also different photoreceptors. So here's a question for you. How has learning about how animals see the world changed how you see the world?
Oh, that's a great question. Um, it has certainly broadened my perspective. If not my own visual sense, at least the way that I interpret that information.
Mm-hmm.
Some thinking about all of the different types of ways that animals detect light, and also I think it really makes you appreciate how artificial our lighting systems are,
Mm-hmm.
and how much that's impacting us as an animal existing in the world. But also, I just find it continually sort of mind blowing and inspiring. The more we learn about animal visual systems and the different ways they're put together, and how that they're processing information differently than we might think, that they're seeing light that we can't see. They're doing incredible behaviors, long distance migrations, um, using the Milky Way for navigation. I mean, all of these amazing things that are all driven by light detection. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I I find it sort of very moving and inspiring in my own perspective of sort of the natural world, to sort of deepen my understanding of that.
Yes. So, do you have a favorite species that you like to study, and or is there a piece of research that actually is provoking and that you keep coming back to that because of it provides just a infinite fascination for you?
I think, well, I have to say, mantis shrimp are probably my favorite
Uh-huh.
group of species to study, just because there's so much. Their visual system is so different than what we understand about most other animals, and we're still really trying to understand that. Um, and I think my work has contributed to the sort of shift in the way that the research community sees um, the molecules for detecting light. There was sort of this dogma that, based on the handful of model species that had been studied, there's a photoreceptor that detects red light. It's going to express a protein sensitive, to red light. There's a photoreceptor that's like sensitive to green. It's expressing a protein that detects green, and so there's sort of this one-to-one correlation. My work with mantis shrimp and a few other early studies, particularly in crustaceans, have shown that, for example, mantis shrimp have up to 16 distinct types of photoreceptors, but they're expressing
Hmm.
30 or more different types of these opsins, these proteins for detecting light. So there's something going on at the molecular level in detecting light that we don't understand yet. And so that's really it's a big mystery still. And I like mysteries, and trying to find ways to understand enough pieces of them that we can put together the full picture. So I think that's really, where my research has contributed the most, is just saying, no, there's not this one-to-one correlation. Some photoreceptors express lots of these proteins sensitive to different wavelengths of light, and we have no idea why yet. But just it doesn't make sense based on the way that we understand vision. So um, there's a mystery
Well,
to be
I mean,
solved.
we we hope that this podcast, Starving for Darkness, will help to pollinate and cross-pollinate ideas. And I will tell you that the lighting industry is very interested in the outcome of your research because we are also just getting into opsins, melanopsin for one, and how
Yeah.
that impacts our own circadian rhythms. So while it may seem very theoretical in another animal, tucked away all the way in Hawaii, actually, I think your research will become very important as we come to learn and understand just how impactful light is on how we feel and perceive the world. So you also study the history of evolution, and you have a paper called lost along the way the significance of evolution in reverse. Can you talk about this research and what you uncovered?
Sure. So because I think a lot about light and the way that
I
different
do
light
too.
environments impacts, yes, the evolution of different visual systems, right? Animals
Hmm.
aren't going to evolve photoreceptors for light that isn't in their environment. So that, light environment is a huge piece of thinking about the evolution of light detection. But the opposite side of that is what happens when there is no light. So
Yes.
I another sort of aspect of my research is actually studying the only animals that live in the only environment we know to be true darkness. So if you think about the deep ocean where sunlight can no longer penetrate, there's still an amazing amount of light we know now from bioluminescence. There's a lot of things down there
Hmm.
that glow. So there's still light. If there wasn't light, you wouldn't see probably eyes anymore. And lots of deep sea things still have weird and bizarre, but they still have eyes. So the only habitat where there's truly no light is underground. It's subterranean. So I've
Hmm.
done quite a bit of work in the study of animals that live their entire life completely underground in the dark, and trying to understand how lack of light impacts um, animals, since we know that light is so important to many, many biological processes and the way that
Hmm.
animals interact with the world. What happens when that's no longer available? How do animals evolve to live in that kind of habitat? So it typically involves losing their eyes. No light, no longer need
Interesting.
for eyes.
So
Um,
the eyes
so I've
evolve
done
out of the species? Is that what you're
So
saying?
there are many. The interesting thing about species that are adapted to live underground in cave or subterranean systems is that they tend to have very convergent traits. So they tend
Hmm.
to have no eyes. They tend to lose their pigmentation. They tend to have lower metabolic rates related to sort of accessibility of food in that environment. They tend to have expanded their other sensory capabilities. So they tend to have a lot more, say, mechanosensors or chemosensors, really long limbs. So there's this whole suite of characters that is associated with living in these environments. Um, and I
That's
have been
really
trying to
interesting.
understand particularly the loss, what happens when you lose a visual system, basically.
Yeah. Well, I have heard that when a human loses a sense, whether it's vision or hearing, that actually it's been reported that people experience a greater sense from another sense. So that the if they lose their vision, then suddenly their hearing becomes so much more heightened. So I think it's kind of interesting if you just think about that more spiritually, perhaps, that if you snuff out one sense, that the organism evolves to have other ways of gleaning around them, their environment. So that's really interesting to see that that's happening down below in the waters.
Yes, and it's sort of a really unique habitat, and it's another instance that I can think of where I don't think many people experience a true lack of light ever. So sitting quietly in a cave with all the lights off, like really hone in, like you sort of zoom in on yourself, like you can hear your blood, your heart beating. It's
Hmm.
just this very sort of spiritual experience where everything else is, all of your other senses, your vision is gone. So all your other senses sort of um, just in that moment are heightened. Um, it's really
I mean,
quite an
Megan, don't get
experience.
me started on that. I'll tell you. um, so, I mean, I'm assuming based on what you just said that you have heard of the deep time experiment that happened in France recently, where I believe
Oh
it was
no.
40 scientists went into a cave. And I think maybe they were there for 40 days. I think they were there for 40 days. And it was an experiment to talk about the perception of time, which is funny to think about. And I think time, as I said earlier, is this amorphous thing that we measure, but actually, time really much shifts. Like if you've ever been on vacation, those first few days last forever. And then
Yeah.
you'll like, "Oh my god, this is going to last forever." And then the second half of the week just zooms by. And that for me is an example of how time actually does bend a little bit. But I think that experiment is so interesting and important. And I have recently written that light brings our awareness outward and darkness brings our awareness inward.
Mm.
And as you're saying it, you can feel your heartbeat. You're suddenly aware of your inner state. And I truly believe that humankind is lacking that meditative moment of inward directed thinking and awareness. And so the fact that you're studying creatures that have never experienced light, I do think is very important to really understand what this void does for a species. And so, are there any interesting facts that you've come across from these deep water species?
From cave species?
Yes.
Um, I think so. I've studied it in a number of contexts, and I am interested at the moment in how. So people tend to think of eyes as, you have an eye and then you don't have an eye, or they just sort of appeared in animals one day as this fully formed thing that worked the way that we are used to it working, and that's not how evolution has worked, or how evolution works. And I'm interested in. There have been lots of people who have studied the how is it possible to evolve a complicated structure like an eye,
Hmm.
and what are the steps and the pieces that come together for that to happen. And I've really been interested on the other side of that. So if you have an eye, what is the process of losing it? So I've been studying this group of flies that are parasites on bats, and they have this really
Hmm.
interesting trajectory where they have different species have different degrees of reduction in their eye, anywhere from sort of, a typical, if you think of a typical housefly, they have a compound eye, so they have lots of facets on that eye. These parasitic flies have, anywhere from like 10 facets down to 2 or 1 or none. And so looking at, as their visual system is reduced, what pieces of it are reduced first. What's happening at the molecular level, what's happening at the sort of structural level, to understand how all of those pieces work together, and how can you sort of shrink down that structure and still maintain function. I think is really interesting. And just gives us insight into, lots of animals move around at night in very dim habitats. And so, how can you modify an eye and still keep it working when there's not that much light around?
It's so true. And I
Yeah.
will say, just in terms of two different species, I live with Ferdinand, my cat. And I mean, I'm blind as a bat in the darkness. And I know he's like got this acute vision. And
Yes.
sometimes I'm looking for him and he's just watching me look for him. So, so I mean, he's like, she's blind as a bat. Um, but I have a funny question for you, which is, if we go back up all the branches of evolution, did it all start from one eye, or have there been almost was were did the eye evolve from two sources or three? Was it the one eye that we sort of all started from, or did this invention happen more than once?
So it's a really interesting question, and I think it depends on well, one, how you're defining an eye, but two, what level are you looking at? So, for example, the opsins, the proteins responsible for detecting light, you can trace those back to a single sort of ancestral gene that at some
Hmm.
point gained the ability to detect light, and then diversified into all of the different versions of that we see in animal vision. So at the molecular level, there's sort of a single origin of light detection in this protein. But at the anatomical level, eyes probably evolved many, many times. And it's that animals, it's advantageous for animals to have high resolution vision in many senses. And so, but where you draw the line between what is an eye and what is not an eye, lots of animals can detect light. When does it become an eye? And so sort of that transition has happened many times in many sort of different flavors. So lots of animals have different types of eyes, which are really interesting. And you can see that. So for example, many things have eyes on their heads like we are used to, right? So they have eyes that sort of look out sort of very from their head region, and they interpret the world that way. But I've been working with a good friend of mine, excuse me, who is studying the evolution of eyes in fan worms. So these marine worms that stick these tentacles out in the water for feeding, and their body is down in a tube. And in fan worms, lots of species have eyes out on these feeding tentacles.
Wow.
Not on the head at all. And there's some species cover their tentacles in eyes. Some have two giant eyes. Some have just, there's a huge diversity of eyes that they've put on their feeding tentacles because that's the only part out in the world that is susceptible to being eaten by a predator, right? So,
Right.
that's an example of that's clearly a different evolutionary origin of eyes than many of the things we're used to. So there are
Right.
lots of examples like that.
You also had spiders on your website. How do spiders see
Yes.
the world differently?
I'm still trying to understand that myself. Again, so we're used to, things with two eyes that, sort of look out and give you depth perception and sort of a certain field of view, and where your eyes are in your head will give you different fields of view. For example, fish have
Well,
two eyes, but they're on the sides, right?
is
Um,
that saying I thought I had to learn that if the eyes are on the sides, it's generally a species of prey, but if they're looking right ahead is generally a predator species. Would you agree or disagree with that statement?
I think I would. Generalizations in biology are hard because there are always going to be exceptions. And so I'm
Yeah.
thinking of all of the exceptions to that. So things like I have a pet chameleon and its eyes are on the side, but
Mhm.
it can move them, right? And it's definitely a
Oh
predator.
my.
So
Wow.
I think there are things that are predators that have side facing eyes, but you can put eyes up on stalks, or they can be movable, so you can sort of point them in whatever direction you need to. So there are lots of ways around that sort of limitation, I guess.
I
um,
see. And so what about
yeah,
spiders? Because spiders are definitely predators.
spiders are definitely predators, and they again are an interesting animal to think about because we are very much interacting in our world in this sort of bimodal way. I mean, it gets integrated into a single picture in our eye. But thinking about spiders who have 8 eyes, so I think the way to think about it is that so we have our pair of eyes and we use it to gather all of the information we need for whatever behaviors we're trying to do, moving around the world, those sorts of things. I think spiders have basically divided up their eyes, into different sets that provide different information for different behaviors, maybe is the best way to think about it. So they often have these really big primary eyes that are forward facing and would be analogous to our eyes, or two big eyes up on the front of their head that are used for hunting. And so high resolution spatial vision. Um, but then they have all these other eyes that are doing other things and pointed in different directions, have different field of views. Um, my research in spiders has been trying to understand what options they have. So, do they have color
Mm-hmm.
vision? Um, And then if they have options that detect colors of light, what eyes are they expressed in? And so we're starting to see patterns where there are different sets of options expressed in different eyes. So clearly they're doing something different with respect to color, at least. I still don't understand what all of the eyes are doing, but again,
Yeah.
it's an interesting puzzle when you see that sort of division in a structure. It certainly suggests specialization, just specialized for what. And I am not a spider biologist, so I'm learning as I go. So if someone out there knows, I would love to have a
Yeah.
conversation. I'm still working on understanding spiders myself. The molecules I understand, understanding how that integrates into the full sort of visual capability of an animal is the next step.
Yeah, it's interesting how a spider would perceive the world. And it does feel, though, that everything is very radial. It has 8 legs around its body.
Mm,
It has 8 eyes. I didn't realize that. And even the web itself is extremely radial. So it's funny to think that, it has this sort of 360 perspective, or maybe 180,
yeah.
but that's very interesting. And so we recently had Dr. Mika Brodsky, your compatriot in Hawaii,
Mhm.
your wildlife compatriot, and that's actually how we were introduced, and so lucky to have you on the show. I'm wondering, so for those who didn't listen to the episode, Dr. Mika Brodsky, he is from the Hawaii Marine Animal Response, and they rescue and protect marine animals. Does your work at all interact in Hawaii in wildlife? It seems like the scale of your species is a bit different, but I'm just wondering.
It is a bit different. I think the way that it interacts right now, I believe you'll be talking to one of my graduate students, Hannah
Yes,
Moon.
Hannah Moon. Yep.
Yes, and in the next month or so, and so she's really doing constant sort of in, investigating visual systems from a conservation perspective, and so you'll hear
Mm.
a lot more about it. But so she's trying to understand seabird vision. We have a lot of endangered or threatened seabirds here in Hawaii, and they um, are night flyers, and so there are
Hmm.
lots of ways that artificial lighting confuses them, impacts them, causes mortality. But no one has really studied the the underlying way that their visual systems work. So there's a lot of conservation efforts going into trying to protect these birds and design lighting systems to either um, keep them from being attracted to human population centers or to light things like power lines up that they run into so that they can avoid them without understanding how they're perceiving the world. And so her work is really aimed at understanding that so that we can do better at um, the sort of resource management and conservation management to protect the animals. Um, so that's again
Yeah.
sort of where that's the most direct example uh, in sort of the research that's happening in my lab. But I think there are plenty of opportunities for the future to think about those same sorts of questions with marine animals, which is where most of the things I study, and understanding how by understanding what they can perceive, how they're detecting light, that can inform the ways that we are lighting human structures in a way that hopefully can mitigate the impacts that it's having.
Yeah, and the bird issue is particularly interesting, and so needed. We're losing 1 billion birds a year in North America due to fatal flight into buildings, and that's just that aspect of it. Red light has been shown in studies to actually send birds to migrate off in the wrong direction because it actually interrupts their ability to use magnetoreception in their bodies. So that type of research would absolutely be gobbled up to better light our environment. So
Yeah,
it's nice to hear that your lab would be focusing on really direct benefits to the lighting industry because right now, that information is really not known or understood in the larger collective consciousness of the lighting industry.
yeah,
We don't light for wildlife, we light for human activity pretty much only. So I have been a firm believer that it is a false dichotomy that we can not only light for human activity, but we can also protect wildlife, and that we're just kind of cheating ourselves to think that those two things are mutually exclusive. So, understanding the impact of light on different opsins and different bird species could be amazing because to this day, I don't even know why it's red light or understand the evolutionary process of why red light. The one explanation I heard, which was really not good enough, was that red light mimics the light of spring. I don't even understand that explanation because I don't really think of spring vernal equinox light as being reddish. So that doesn't even make sense to me. So I'm just telling you right now, your research is absolutely needed. We need
Oh,
more
thank you.
understanding.
Well, and
Yeah.
I think it's interesting, again, that sort of understanding that difference between how we perceive the world and how an animal does really will let us find, the differences are important as well. So understanding the differences in how we see the world and the sorts of lights we can detect and that we need, can we find areas that are different enough that will work for us but isn't going to impact another species. So it's all about understanding both sides of that in order to find lighting solutions that work. um, and it's species dependent, unfortunately, so you have to go out and do a lot more sort of just basic science groundwork to be able to answer that in a broad scale way.
Yeah. And there's been research that's shown that pollinators choose differently when there's LED light present because it skews the colors of the flowers. So one of the first
Mhm.
things that I thought of when looking over your research was just wondering how much stray light reaching these aquatic ecosystems is actually skewing the colors beneath. Perhaps, as you're saying, there are species that use light as camouflage, so that they can't be seen from below, that maybe there is a negative impact of light that really changes the relationships of the prey and the predators. I mean, that's just an example of potentially what could
Yeah.
happen. It's not that
Yeah,
it is
certainly.
happening.
Yeah. Um,
Yes.
yeah, anytime you're shifting the light environment and animals are, you know, evolved to work within, say, blue light, and you're throwing a bunch more light in there, um, it's going to have impacts. What those are, it can be hard to predict sometimes, but for sure.
Yes. So, you also, according to your Twitter description, are a diver, caver,
Yes.
hiker,
Yes.
crafter, and lover of weird eyes who studies animal vision evo devo, so evolution development. I wasn't
Yes.
familiar with that speak, but I figured it out. Um, so I love to hear about people's tangential pursuits and what they are able to bring back with them to their work and what their work gives their tangential pursuits or their art. So, how have I mean, diving, I think, is really obvious. I think when you're diving, you're communing with nature. But I mean, if you have had any special interactions as while you're diving, I'd love to hear about it. But you also craft and you hike. So, how have these endeavors really made you a better scientist?
I mean, I think so. So hiking, particular here, I focus a lot on the marine realm. So
Mhm.
uh, getting into natural terrestrial systems, which can be hard here in Hawaii. We've lost so much of our native forests, but um, getting into those natural native spaces. I love Hawaii. The forests here, for me, growing up in the Midwest, I'm used to, deciduous forests and a particular kind of forest. Coming here where the forests are, say, um, ferns. You have
Mhm.
ferns that are tree sized and diversity of ferns, and the is such a different experience being out in nature when that community is so different. It was really surprising to me, actually, the first time I hiked through a native Hawaiian forest, how different it felt.
Wow.
Um,
Yeah.
and so I think that is important, to experience those different natural spaces, um,
Hmm.
and and really just commune with nature. But I mean, as a biologist, I'm doing it because I enjoy that and I want to understand that. And so, going out and observing nature and different types of natural environments, um, you know, uh, seeing things, species, plants, animals, observing interactions. That's where, as a biologist, we see something unusual. We're like, huh, I wonder how that works. Like that's that's how we get
Hmm.
our basic inspiration, is going out, observing the natural world and asking questions. So that sort of keeps that curiosity and that sort of inquisitive nature alive, I think, in some sense.
Hmm. And what kind of crafts do you do?
Oh, so a little bit of everything, I guess. Right now, I'm very much into, yeah, I make quilts and sew, and right now
Mm.
I'm into basket making at the moment
Hmm.
for some reason. I think a friend inspired me into that path. So I see a direct link between being creative and creative endeavors and science. I think they're very much intertwined in ways that aren't always appreciated. And you have to be creative as a scientist. Um, you have to be able to see the world from a different perspective, sometimes to find questions, to really get behind and answer questions in a new way that people haven't thought of. And I see that as directly tied to being creative in other aspects of my life. So that sort of making things and being creative and trying to piece together how things fit, like if you're sewing a quilt, or piecing together a basket, or like that one, it's very meditative for me to get
Yep.
into that headspace that's away from work. But I think
Hmm.
also sort of exercising that creativity portion of my brain that helps me when I do come back to science, because I I'm used, you sort of exercise that ability, I think, to think differently and see things differently and piece things together in new ways. So I see them as very intertwined endeavors.
Yeah, I love your answer, and it's like exactly why I asked the question, because I think there's something very special that happens when you're doing a repetitive movement like making a basket with your hands, that it occupies enough of your brain to then let another part of your brain
Yeah,
free run. And have you,
exactly.
when you get into that place of flow, I think that flow state is really it's almost like a lubricant for creativity in many other aspects of life, because there's been many times where I personally am doing something creative off topic, but then an idea which is more based in my work comes through because my brain was suddenly occupied, and that it left space for another sort of deeper running current in my brain. Have you ever had a
Yes.
great idea come through while you've been basket weaving or diving or doing these less work related activities?
Oh, absolutely. I find that when I clear my mind, and do that, whether sometimes when it's, I'm out running and just letting my brain wander, or swimming or diving, like if you can hit that flow state, as you said, ideas sort of just bubble up. And if you're sort of learn to
Yes.
to
Yeah.
to to be in that moment, but pay attention to that, like a lot of my really good ideas have come from those sorts of moments where I'm not focused or really even thinking about science. I'm just letting my mind wander, and it finds ways to make those connections that I wouldn't be able to force consciously. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think this also goes back to darkness and the importance of it, because I feel like, a little bit the modern conception, especially in America here, that is, we should work X amount of hours per week at maximum efficiency. Lights will be on from the minute we wake up to the minute we go to sleep. If I get an email, I'm still obligated. It doesn't matter what time it is. So there's this
Yeah.
always on factor. And we've robbed ourselves of a different way of perceiving and thinking. And I think art and artistic pursuits, or pursuits that aren't directly tied to a livelihood, can provide a waking version of this um, different way of perceiving our work and asking questions about it, as well as darkness is brings a different mind state that also gives access to a different perspective. So I that's why I love asking people about their art in the world, because I think it's such an important aspect. And also, we tell children, oh, try soccer, try art. We have them try all these different things, but we don't encourage that so much in adults. And I think there's a
Yeah.
loss there for sure. For sure.
Yeah. No, I agree. I have I have with varying degrees of success at different points in my life, but always tried to um, stay connected to a creative endeavor in some way, just because I do feel it is so important to our our well-being as as an individual, right? There's a connection there that is hard to find in other places.
Hmm. So you are on which island in Hawaii?
Oahu.
And so I'm interested in your island culture. Actually, we're having someone come on from the island of Nantucket, which is on the East Coast here. And what I think is so interesting about these islands is that you're far enough away from the mainlands that you could actually gain control of light pollution, because it's a smaller area of land to actually make a difference. So could do you are you seeing any awareness rising, or are you seeing more awareness than before?
So I have been here for 6 years, so I'm not sure that I have a long enough perspective to
Mhm.
know sort of uh, if perceptions around lighting are changing. I hope so. I think as more research is done and people talk about it more, and there's just more awareness, and that sort of filters out into a broader group of people and into the community, I think that will make a difference. I think the hard part about the islands here is getting that to filter into the tourist industry, and
Mhm.
particularly here on Oahu, where we have, say, Waikiki, which is full of hotels and um, lit up at night. The beach is lit up at night. Changing that mindset, I think, is going to be the hardest. But I think it's possible, and I think it's possible if we can get the community behind it, and sort of that comes from within. But I think that's going to be the biggest challenge here is changing the mindset of the tourist industry and the hotels and the um, that side of things.
Yeah, and what is your citizen opinion when you look up at the dark sky? Do you have a decent access to the stars?
There are certainly parts of the islands, yes. Here, so in Honolulu, in the Honolulu side of the island, it's pretty hard. Um,
Mm.
I remember,
Mm.
so my husband and I, like, occasionally, like when a meteor comes through, and I like drag him out in the middle of the night to go see shooting stars. It can be really hard without driving across the island to find someplace dark enough
Mm.
to really appreciate it. There are still places on the other islands where you do get night skies, dark night skies, and that's amazing when you find those places. But it can be hard on this island, and we're the most populated, so even
Right.
here in the middle of the ocean, it can be difficult. But there are
Yeah.
places in the islands where that's possible, and I hope people, you know, as as populations grow, that is a priority as a community we set as a high one, that people try to preserve those night skies.
People just don't yet know what they're missing. And so I
Yeah.
really believe that if we can get them to remember how good darkness can feel and how beautiful the stars are, that we could actually tip the awareness and get the stars back by 2030. So,
That would
Megan,
be
thank you
amazing.
so much for coming on the show. It was wonderful to pick your brain about all things visual and the crazy eyes that are out there watching all that humans are doing. And so I think your
Thank
work is
you.
so important and that it really is needed. And I can tell you firsthand from the lighting industry, we are studying opsins in the human eye. So your research will be used and will be important to our work in the future. So thank you for sharing it with us. And thank you for coming
Thank
on the
you.
show.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Folks, I know you just fell in love with Starving for Darkness once again. Every show is such a mind blower for me, and I'm so grateful for our guests and for Jane Slade and everything, all the work she's doing, and all the contributions everybody's making. But before we do, we got to go to the magicians. We got to thank them. Evluma.com. That's EVLUMA.com. Hover over products, click on dark sky friendly lighting, and let's do it. Greg, what do they got down there?
Well, with their OmniMax product, it maintains illuminance efficiently. They said that once, and I'm like, that's important because, or ambiance, I should say, efficiently. Ambiance and lighting. They have the
Ooh.
Kelvin temperatures covered, and they make it efficient by being LED. So they've got everything you need without sacrificing the light you love.
So Starving for Darkness, thanks you folks. Go to starvingfordarkness.com, but also Evluma, the magicians. That's EVLUMA.com. Come on, click it. Hover over products, click on dark sky friendly lighting, and get her done. Thanks for listening, folks.